So in recent days, I have been doing quite an extensive amount of work proofreading tourism adverts or tourism uh, tour descriptions for a friend. She doesn't speak English as a first language, so I've been checking the grammar basically. And a lot of the sites that she is featuring as part of the tour is in Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam. Um, so it kind of got me thinking just of the country in general and of the Vietnam War. By coincidence, Arlie Ermy passed away recently at 74, the former Marine turned actor who is best known for his role of Gunnery Sergeant Hartman in Full Metal Jacket, a character that anyone who has seen that film will never forget. So I watched the film recently, and I've just been thinking about the subject generally. Um, the Vietnam War, when most people think about it, a lot of people, if you're not a veteran, a lot of people automatically think of the numerous hard hitting films that have been made about that conflict. Films like Full Metal Jacket, Apocalypse Now, Casualties of War, Platoon, Born on the 4th of July. And almost universally, those films are anti war. Now, before I continue, I want to be very, very clear in this video. I don't want to be misunderstood. I I've studied this conflict and I've long regarded it as a massive, massive foreign policy mistake. And I have no doubt that both Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon have the blood of many thousands of Southeast Asians on their hands. There is a good reason why this conflict is as notorious as it is. There were unquestionably some morally dubious, to say the least, things done during that war by the United States, which was and is a superpower. More bombs were dropped on Vietnam than during the whole of World War II, according to some sources. So it's understandable. But also, this was coming at a time, needless to say, when there was drastic social changes in the United States. Veterans were coming back, and instead of being treated like heroes, they were treated with contempt, which in many cases, most cases, was grossly unfair. Um, so it's understandable why the Vietnam War has such a raw memory, particularly in the United States. Technically, this was the Second Indochina War, the first being the war with France between 1945 and 1954. In fact, there was a series of wars in Indochina in that region, including Laos and Cambodia, right up until the 1980s, including the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979. But when we think of the Vietnam War, which is known in Vietnam itself as the American War or the Vietnam-American War, that's a big conflict we think of from the period of roughly 1965 to 1973, when the last American troops left. The war formally ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. And yeah, so I've just been thinking about it as a subject. Now, I've long suspected that the narrative of the noble Vietcong versus the evil Americans has been too simplistic. And I'm going to read out an article from Wikipedia that really testifies to this. And I want to just make a few observations about this. If the video gets cut off, I hope it doesn't. But if it does, I'll make a part two. The Hue Massacre, 1968, in Hue City. That was the same year of the decisive Hue City battle. Very important year for the Vietnam War. The year, of course, of the and the year which recorded the most American casualties. I think almost half of all American casualties in Vietnam occurred in the year 1968, including a distant relation of mine, Sergeant Robert Dale Hazlett, who died in South Vietnam that year. So I'm going to read out an article here about the Hue Massacre. This is the name given to the summary executions and mass killings perpetrated by the Vietcong and People's Army of Vietnam during their capture, occupation, and later withdrawal from the city of Hue during the Tet Offensive, considered one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War. The Battle of Hue began on January the 31st, 1960, and lasted a total of 26 days. During the months and years that followed, dozens of mass graves were discovered in and around Hue. Victims included women, men, children, and infants. The estimated death toll was between 2,800 and 6,000 civilians and POWs, or 5 to 10% of the total population of the city. The Republic of Vietnam, that's South Vietnam, released a list of 4,062 victims identified as having either been murdered or abducted. Victims were found bound, tortured, and sometimes buried alive. Many victims were also clubbed to death. A number of US and South Vietnamese authorities, as well as a number of journalists who investigated the events, took the discoveries, along with other evidence, as proof that a large scale atrocity had been carried out in and around Hue during its 4 week occupation. The killings were perceived as part of a large scale purge of a whole social stratum, including anyone friendly to American forces in the region. Bear in mind, by the way, this was taking place at the same time as the massively destructive Cultural Revolution in China. The massacre of Hue came under increasing press scrutiny later, with press reports exposed that South Vietnamese revenge squads had also been at work in the aftermath of the battle, searching out and executing citizens that had supported the communist occupation. According to Vietnam historian Stanley Carno, balanced accounts have made it clear, however, that the communist butchery at Hue did take place, perhaps on an even larger scale than reported during the war. So let's say the figure is between 2,800 and 6,000. Let's say a median figure of 4,000 people killed in this massacre. Now, to put that in context, a far more famous atrocity that took place the same year at My Lai, which was, of course, at the hands of American troops, has had, I would argue, far, far more coverage. Why is that? I think one reason is that the communists won the Vietnam War. Vietnam became unified under communism, which has stayed to this day. Now, the good news is American Vietnamese relations have been greatly improved since the war, and are very strong today, partly as a bulwark to China. But as we now mark 50 years, half a century since that most turbulent of years, since the Battle of Hue and the My Lai Massacre, should it not be that the Hue City Massacre should also be remembered? I mean, to me, this is just demonstrative of the fact that communist states hide their crimes, they hide their past. This is one reason I have such contempt for communism as an ideology and as a political system. You know, it's right that the My Lai massacre is documented, and incidentally, there was also a lot of massacres carried out by South Korean troops during the Vietnam War, which also, although they were allied with the Americans, they're not as well documented, at least not by Hollywood, as the massacres at the hands of the Americans. Um, some of these include, just bear with me a second, include the Ha Mai massacre, 135 civilians killed, again 1968 by Republic of Korea Marines, and there were many others. Um, this was a very, very brutal war, and absolutely no side can claim moral high ground in terms of bloodshed. But I think because the communists won, there has definitely been a rewriting of history. In Vietnam, there is a War Remnants Museum. Now, I haven't been to Vietnam, but it would not surprise me if that museum sanitizes communist crimes. I don't know, I haven't been there, but that's the impression I get from reading about it, that it is documenting American crimes, but exonerating Vietcong crimes. Now, that cannot be right. Vietnam is still an authoritarian state, it's still a single party state, and like China, it doesn't, I don't think it is honest about its past. I do understand the argument. This was third world peasant people rising up against a superpower, so I understand the sentimental issue there. But it cannot be right that communist atrocities are censored within Vietnam, as I believe they are. And this is communism for you. The same thing happens in China. To this day, Mao Zedong's crimes are barely mentioned, even though Mao killed far more people than any occupying force in Chinese history. In Vietnam, yes, the Americans were guilty of some appalling things, so were South Korean and South Vietnamese forces, but the fact of the matter is, the Vietcong were not squeaky clean either. They did carry out some appalling massacres, not against American troops, against civilians. And I believe that's largely been forgotten. There's a few videos online of this atrocity, but they pale in comparison to how My Lai has been covered. Um, and again, I'm not for a second suggesting that American atrocity shouldn't be covered. I mean, Hollywood has really virtually every Vietnam War film, with I would say the exception of We Were Soldiers and Green Berets, I believe it was called with John Wayne. Virtually every Vietnam War film, and don't get me wrong, they're powerful films, have been from an anti-war perspective. But part of the side effect of this, I believe, is presenting one side as evil and one side as noble. I don't think it's that simple. Very few wars are that simple. Yes, the Viet Cong were a peasant people, taking on a superpower, but they brutalized their fellow Vietnamese civilians. I mean, they brutalized Vietnamese civilians. There's absolutely no question about this. So I hope at some point in the future that Vietnam is a bit more honest about this aspect of its past. By all means, document, you know, uh, Vietnamese victory in the war, document American crimes, etc. But this is communism, hiding from the past. And, people can say Americans glorify their past, but the fact is, you can read about the My Lai massacre on the internet in the United States. You can talk about it. The Vietnam, I mean, the very fact that American directors have made powerful films critical of the Johnson and Nixon administrations shows that there is that aspect of democracy that is sacred, which is an openness. And that's right. It is right that the Vietnam War, the American role in the Vietnam War is seen the way it is to a large extent. I'm under no illusions that this was a war that was conducted with real brutality by all sides. But I do think that as time goes on, there needs to be more honesty about the atrocities committed by the communists because they also had rivers of blood on their hands, civilian blood, and that is just a plain fact. So, if you say to the average person, especially left leaning person, the Vietnam War, they will immediately think, oh, American brutality. They won't think of communist brutality. Now, is that right? I don't know. I think people should be more open minded and more balanced and honest in their overview of this. If you're a Vietnam veteran and you happen to be watching this, an American Vietnam veteran, let me know your thoughts. If you're Vietnamese, let me know your thoughts. I'll keep the comment section open. I'm not trying to, be insulting to Vietnam. I think Vietnam's a fascinating country. And I do understand the sentiment of a poor developing country defeating a superpower. I understand that. But all I'm saying is that there has to be honesty about the past. The only way any country can move forward is by being honest about its past. The United States has had to be honest about its past, its civil rights era, um, the turmoil of the 1960s. Vietnam is an authoritarian state, and I think to move forward, Vietnam needs to be also honest about the less savory aspects of its past. Thanks for watching.